Hey, assalamu alaikum everyone. Um, it's good to see you all for the, I believe, fourth session. So as always, we'll start with just a simple breathing practice just to make ourselves more present. So we'll take a few deep breaths. If you feel it, just a sense of stillness, feel your feet connected to the ground, spine upright, feel yourself supported. And from this position of stillness and being connected and grounded, we're going to make our intentions. We intend true knowledge, and all true knowledge is a knowledge of disclosure. We intend nafa wal intifa' to benefit ourselves first and foremost, to put knowledge into practice, and to be of benefit to others. All true knowledge is an alignment to the realities of La ilaha illallah and what that entails. So we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala show us the truth as the truth and give us the ability to follow through with what it entails. And He show us the falsehood as falsehood and give us the ability to abstain from what we're meant to abstain from. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala connect us to the sources of this religion, the outward and the inward. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala connect us to those hearts that are connected, to those hearts that are connected all the way back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we seek all of this ibtigha' li wajhillahi ta'ala wa mardatihi wa thawabihi, purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. La li shay'in duna, not for anything else besides. So we'll take a minute just to bring these meanings to our hearts, and then we'll start. Bismillah. فاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. اللهم صل على سيد محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. Alhamdulillah. So I did promise that today we're going to start looking at the life of Abu Hassan al-Shadhili, um, who could be called the founder of the Shadhili Tariqah, um, although effectively he's part, as we said in the previous lesson, as all tariqas would be, of a continuity of a lineage going all the way back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in many ways, the names that these tariqas take on are only an allusion to prominent personalities and people in that lineage. They're not so much founded by them in so much as this tributary of this tradition or this light passes through them, then it takes on the color of the vessel of their being. And we'll see this very much in the nature of the life of Abu Hassan al-Shadhili. Um, it's important when we're framing someone that we have some understanding of the historical currents that were present at his time. And Sheikh Abu Hassan Shadhili was at a juncture where there was a lot of uh, change happening within the Muslim world. And one of the major boundaries of this change was what would be known as the Islamic West or the Maghrib and the Islamic East or the Mashriq. And if there was to be a boundary between them, you would say then the Maghrib would start from what was then known as Ifriqiya, but would be modern day Tunisia, and the Mashriq would start from Masr or Egypt. And this interplay between the East and the West, between the Mashriq and the Maghrib, was something that would happen kind of quite regularly. And you could say that the very founding of the Islamic nature of the Maghrib was through such a movement or migration, namely that of Idris al-Awwal, who arriving from Arabia founded the city of Fez and the Idrisid dynasty, which lasted until the latter half of the 10th century. And Maghrib itself, within the that region of Tunisia, modern day Morocco, we'd call it, took on a very interesting flavor, especially as we go into the what was known as the Murabit. In English, they usually translate as Al-Muravid, but it's really the Murabitun, the Murabit stage of the Maghrib, and that was the state patronage of the Maliki fuqaha. So they took on a very strong Maliki flavor. Now, Sheikh Abu Hassan is being born on the backdrop of this kind of political situation, this interchange between the West and the East, but also what could be referred to as a time of crisis. And I think this is somewhat relevant to the way a lot of Muslims see the world today. So, prior to the birth of Sheikh Abu Hassan Shadhili, there was the ending or the deposing of the Murabitun um, empire by what are known as the Muwahhidun, or in English, the Al-Mawhids. This was a movement that was initially founded by Ibn Tumart, who declared himself to be the Mahdi, but it was one of his disciples, Abd al-Mu'min, and it was who basically was part of this actually taking on a dynastic kind of perspective. And it was a North African Berber Muslim empire. And so the idea of an intrinsic Maghribi or regional representation, and Berber in this case, was quite an interesting marked point for that region because it was the first time when an indigenous kind of presence could have come, even though the Murabitun had elements of Berber culture, the inception of that was pretty much from the East. And so what was interesting is at round about the same time, pretty much just before Abu Hassan Shadri is born, he's born in 1196, but roughly a few years before that, the Ayyubid Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi seeks the assistance of the navy from the Muwahid movement, who are now in charge of Maghrib, and then they also have through that Andalus, parts of Andalus. And the third Muwahid Khalif called Yaqub al-Mansur declines. And in the wake of that, there becomes the um, essentially the collapse uh, of uh, the Muwahid kind of dynasty not long afterwards, um, primarily through alliances of Christian kings in Andalusia. And so uh, when Abu Hassan Shadli is born, he's born in 1196, as I said. Um, in by the time he's 16, um, the Muwahid Khalif Muhammad al-Nasir, who's a successor of Yaqub Mansur, is defeated by an alliance of Christian kings. And this is very much the prominent part of what's known as the Christian Reconquista, which is the Christian um, reconquering of Andalus from the Muslims. And so it's during Sheikh Abu Hassan's um, life, when he's, for example, 16, the Muslims suffer one of the big losses, this Battle of Las Navas del Tolosa. And very shortly after that, um, there is the siege of Cordoba, and it was during his life that the siege of Seville happens. So the only real Muslim enclave left in Granada, in Andalusia, was Granada, which basically becomes a tributary state to the Christians, eventually falls afterwards. So there's obviously this kind of upheaval happening, and pretty much um, uh, just before Abu Hassan Shadli's life, there was also the brutal crusades in Egypt and Greater Syria. And there is the Mongol destruction of Baghdad that happens pretty much contemporaneous with his life, towards the end of his life, or roughly around about that time. And so we can see that this is a time of a lot of strife in the Muslim world. And why am I mentioning this is because it's also very interesting to note that as a historical phenomenon, at the very moments where you would imagine that the Muslims are at their weakest politically, um, and there's all sorts of very, very traumatic upheavals, and Muslims are losing land, and they're being defeated militarily, and they're losing their sacred masjids, and they're being defiled. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in his sha'n, in his prerogative in the affair, seems to have actually been performing almost contemporaneously with this political upheaval, a spiritual revival. And so in the East, around about that time, this is probably a generation before Sheikh Abbas Shadli, but we had the great scholar Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani. And he's someone who Imam Nawawi said that he said, we have never known anyone more dignified than Baghdad's Sheikh. He was known as Muhyiddin Abdul Qadir Jilani, who was known as the Sheikh of the Shafi'is and the Hanabila, because he was a qualified scholar of the Shafi and Hanbali madhab, but he was also a great Sheikh of Tasawwuf. And at the same time that prior to him, the Muslims had lost Masjid al-Aqsa, Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani ends up being the teacher, and his pupils become the teacher of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, who obviously we know was the one who liberated Masjid al-Aqsa. And there's also in the east the maternal cousin of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani, Sidi Ahmad al-Rifai. So there's this tremendous spiritual revival happening, but almost with that, because we said there's this interchange between the East and the West, that this period also sees a tremendous spiritual revival in the West. And so the luminaries such as Ghawth Abu Madian, who, as we spoke about this interchange between East and West, he's basically a student of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani. And he takes on the title Al-Ghawth, just as Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani was known as Al-Ghawth. This is within the kind of spiritual terminology, kind of a term that denotes a very, very esteemed spiritual rank. Um, and then he has a student, Abdus Salam ibn Mashish. And also at this time, you'll find Ibn Arabi, who they say never met Ghawth Abu Madian physically, but is connected to him spiritually, and he refers to him as Shaykh al-Mashayikh. Then you have the great poet Abu Hassan al-Shushtari. Then you have Ibn Sab'in. And it's also some of the greatest names that we're seeing at that time, because you've also got Jalaluddin al-Rumi, one of the most eminent Sufis, and also in the Persian language, Farid ad-Din al-Attar at roughly the same time. Sadruddin al-Qunwi, who's the stepson and inheritor of Ibn Arabi. Umar ibn al-Farid, one of the probably arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest Sufi poet of the Arabic language. And it was on the backdrop of roughly round about this period that in 1196, in a place called, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, called Quetta, Ceuta, the name is Ali. He's born to uh, a patron patrilineal lineage that is from the Bani Hashim tribe through the Idrisid lineage. So he's Hassani from his father, and it's said that he was matrilineally through his mother's lineage. It was a Berber tribe from the Ghumara tribe, and that lineage was Husseini. So he was from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's lineage, both from his mother and father. And this is relevant. This is especially relevant in the context of the Maghrib, because there's been a very strong connection between many of the saints, both in spiritual authority, but even in political authority, going from the time of, as we said, Idris al-Awwal, Idris al-Thani, going back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam through the Hasni lineage. And we don't actually know that much about his life, his early life, except that he was an exceptional student. Um, and he was sent, like many of the exceptional students of his time, to go and study in Fez. And it's said that while studying there, he then becomes a master of knowledge, exceptional knowledge. And much of what his biographical information comes from I had referenced two books to be read, or to be looked as references, and they are the Lataif al-Minan, uh, the the I think it's Nancy Roberts who's translated that, um, and then there was also a book called I think Durrat al-Asrar, I think it's called. So Lataif al-Minan is translated is by Ibn Ata'ala, translated by Nancy Robert, and the other is by Ibn Sabbar, um, which is also a biographical book, which is a reference to the life of Abu Hassan Shadli and the original founders like Abu Basim Mursi and Ibn Ta'il al-Iskandari. And so what's interesting, at a certain age, Abu Hassan Shadli is, subhanAllah, he is, whilst acquiring all of this knowledge, he has this strong desire to seek spiritual knowledge. And in this seeking of spiritual knowledge, he travels, and this is why it's relevant, why I was often speaking about this interchange between the East and the West, that he travels to the east, and his words, looking for the qutb, which is a kind of a spiritual axis or a person who is entrusted with some kind of spiritual authority to be a guide. And my own understanding or surmising from that is because of the importance of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani. So he's looking for that kind of lineage. And he goes there, and Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani has passed away by that time. But what's very interesting is that the biographers say that he connects with students of Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani and students of the maternal cousin of Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani, Sidi Ahmad al-Rifai, and his Khalifa is someone called Shaykh Abdul Fath al-Wasiti. And it says that he stays there in Baghdad, um, uh, in that area of Iraq, until there's different narrations, but they say like the Sheikh al-Wasiti basically tells him, you're looking for the spiritual master, you're looking for the spiritual guide of this age, and he's where you've come from. And Sheikh Abu Hassan Shadili then says, how will I find him? And so now here's some of the references that we were trying to speak about, this Hikmah lineage and the idea of some of the motives of the Hikmah lineage. And so in the literature, it says that Al-Wasiti or some other figure says, follow the light. So basically, you'll know him by the light. And so he returns back to where he's from. And I didn't mention that he's from a region close to Tetuan, which is that area where he was born. And there's a mountain there called Jabal Alam. Um, and, you know, because he's got this readiness and he's looking, he senses the light that he's looking for rising above this mountain, Jabal Alam. And I don't know if any of you've been there. It's an amazing place. I would recommend going there because basically at the top of Jabal Alam was someone called Mawla ibn Islam ibn Mashish. And he's written, Mawla Abd Islam ibn Mashish is a very well-known um, today. He's very well known today for his 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 kind of his litany, that is a salutations called this Salatul Mashishiyah, which is a salutations upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if those of you who haven't heard of it, I would advise you to just maybe I could do a Google search and give you a link which you could hear it. But it's a very powerful litany. Now, he's someone who's living at the top of this mountain in a kind of almost spiritual retreat. And nowadays, if you take the car up, it's a kind of a steep ride still, but you get there within a few minutes. It could take up to half an hour or something, or 25 minutes or something. But obviously, in those days, it would be a bit of a trek to go up to that mountain. And as he's approaching it, there's just above just below the kind of the peak point of the mountain, there's a spring. So Abu Hassan Shadili decides to freshen himself and do wudu. And as he approaches, there's different narrations when he arrives upon Mullah Abdus Salam al-Mashish. He sees him reading the Quran with one of his sons. So this is also an indication that even though he's there on his own, he's not completely isolated, and either he's joined by his family there, or periodically his family visits him there. And then when he sees him and his son, he says it seemed initially he thought they were swaying when they were reading the Quran. But as he gets closer, he realizes it's as if the whole mountain is actually swaying with the recitation. In any case, as he kind of gets very close to the Sheikh and he's just about to introduce himself, and the Sheikh just addresses him and says, "You cannot come to us in a state of impurity. Return back and perform wudu." So Imam Abu Hassan Shadli um, basically goes back down to the spring, and uh, it's something that even today a lot of people who go there, it's now known as Ain al-Shadiliya, the spring of the Shadilis, and it's still there. I have had a chance to visit it, and you can go and you can do your wudu there. It's such a picturesque place. I mean, subhanallah, I find Morocco in general is a beautiful, picturesque place, but there's also a kind of a tangible spiritual presence in these places. So he goes down and he performs his wudu again, and he goes up again. And lo and behold, as he enters Mullah Abdus Salam, again, Mullah Abdus Salam said, "We told you not to return until you've done your wudu." Now, obviously, there's something happening here, and Abu Hassan Shadli is not an ordinary person. You know, he's someone who's been traveling all the way to the east and has come all the way back, and is someone who's studied the sciences, and he's been in the highest of spiritual company already. He's been with the students of Sidi Ahmad Rifai and the students of Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani. So there's something that he feels there's something coming, and Allah inspires him as he's going down, that he thinks, what is the reality of wudu? That when you wash yourself, you want to wash yourself not just with the outward water, but with the ma'al mutlaq, the absolute water that purifies you from your aspects of yourself that you see, your self-identifications of your ideas and your aspirations and your perceptions and your identity of yourself. So he really surrenders in his wudu and allows for this wudu to purify him from basically seeing himself. And as he goes up, this time the greeting is completely different. And Mullah Abdul Salam says, "Marhaban ya Ali, welcome Ali." And then he narrates his entire lineage to him. He says, "I've been waiting for you." And then he says, "If you want to fetch water, you go with an empty bucket to the well. A full bucket has no room for water." And this is also a very interesting um, analogy that Mullah Abdul Salam gives him, because Mullah Abdul Salam is basically telling him that one of the ways you benefit on the spiritual path is by emptying yourself at the inception. And if there's a word is worth looking at, it's usually used in the context of Christian mysticism, but it's a key word in the spiritual path, and it's called kenosis, not gnosis, which is G, silent G, N-O-S-I-S, but kenosis, K-E-N-O-S-I-S, kenosis. It's used in Christian mysticism a lot, but it's generally understood as a mystic concept. And what it means is self-emptying, because a lot of the spiritual path is actually an emptying of who we've taken ourselves to be. And it's only when we allow ourselves to be stripped of our own identification. And this is actually how a lot of the aphorisms of Ibn Ata'illah start. So when we do start reading the aphorisms of Ibn Ata'illah, we'll find that the first aphorism is to do with من علامات الاعتماد على العمل نقصان رجاء عند وجود الزلل. From the sign of someone's reliance on their own sense of doing and their deeds is a loss of hope as soon as they have a misstep. So what does that mean? A reliance on your own sense of doing, that I'm the one who achieves, I'm the one who can do this. So what we're being asked to do in the spiritual path is to seek to do without a reliance on our own doing. And then after that, there's other forms of stripping. There is the desire for a person to have tajreed, to be in a retreat, to be not. Whilst Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may have put him in a place of asbab, you know, he's in a workplace. He has to partake of this world. But if he wants that, it's this sense of control again. I need to have the environment based on how I want it to be, or a sense of his own himma, Yani the sawabiqul himam, his sense of his own power. And we find this in some of the spiritual literature. They call it the power of manifestation, the law of manifestation. If I can master this law and I can manifest something. And the key of this being anti-spirituality is I. And who is the one manifesting? If it's something that returns back to that egoic I, i.e., my sense of control, my sense of ability, my sense of my knowledge, my sense, then it's the very antithesis of spirituality. Because the spirituality wants to undo that. And so here, in that very inception, you find Mullah Abdus Salam teaching one of the foundational precepts of the spiritual path. And then we have a period where Sina Abu Hassan Shadri is spending company with Mullah Abdul Salam al-Mashish. And what's very interesting was that he was effectively considered, he's considered his only student. So this great teacher, who from a lineage perspective, they say that he was the grand student of Ghawth Abu Madian, who was the direct student of Abdul Qadir Jilani. So he's from Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani's lineage, and it's as if his entirety of what he's meant to give is meant to be given to Sayyid Muhassan Shadili, um, known as Ali ibn Abdullah ibn Abdul Jabbar al-Hassani wal-Husayni, because he's both Hassani and Husayni, al-Shadili. And so I'll tell you how he gets to be called Shadili. But so Sheikh Abu Hassan stays with him in this hermitage at the top of Jabal Alam. And then there's some interesting lessons uh, he starts seeing, because he sees from the supplication of um, Mullah Abdus Salam, is he starts saying, "Oh Allah, people complain to you of the heat, this sense of heat of choosing and self-direction, but I complain to you of the bard, the coolness of taslim, and this sense of being with Allah." So he's like, most people want this coolness of Hassan Shah. So he asks him and he says, well, Mullah Abdus Salam is telling him that unlike the first category, the second category is still a veil as well, but it's more subtle because you're inclining towards it. And if you incline to, and that's why there's this idea that there's hujab, there are veils of the aghyar, they are the veils of this otherness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but there are also veils of anwar, of spiritual experiences. But if we stop with them, if we stop with this sense of contentment, if we stop with this sense of I had this opening, then are we really slaves? As one of my teachers said, Shattan, what a big difference there is between the Abd al-Fath, the one who is the slave of the spiritual opening, and the one who's Abd al-Fattah, one who's the slave of the opener. Because the one who's the slave of the opening is ultimately subsumed by some hal, some selfish ambition for themselves, which is the very opposite of ubudiyah. And the one who's the slave of the opener is there for whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. Whether he gives him this or gives him that, he's with him in the Jamal, in these states of bliss, but he's also with him in the Jalal, in these states of divine rigor. And so he stays with him in that place, and he there's one day when he sees Mullah Abdus Salam with his son, and he comes to his mind that he says, maybe Mullah Abdus Salam will teach me Ismullah al-A'zam. And this is a concept, another Hikmah concept, which is the idea of the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this heart knowledge being embodied in the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the real khilafah of Sayyidina Adam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we taught Adam al-asma kulluha. We taught Adam all of the names. And this is almost in a response to the querying of the angels. And the querying of the angels is not a querying of opposition, it's a querying of their ghira, because they're so given to being in love with Allah. So they said, are you going to make someone who tufsidu fiyah, who will sow corruption and cause blood to be shed? Allah said He knows what they don't know. And then the response comes that He taught Adam the names. So the idea is that these names is the totality of the tajalliyat of the ways by which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to be known in the domain of relationship, which is why every name has a relationship function. And this is what is made Sayyidina Adam a Khalifa fil ard. Inni ja'ilun fil ardi Khalifa. That he's going to be a Khalifa fil ard. Not the Khalifa in the heavens, but he'll be Khalifatun fil ard because it's in the ard, in the earth, in this worldly domain, that the tajalliyat of the names take place in their entirety. And so the Sufis have this understanding that the greatest of the names is the name that is jami'un, that is all encompassing of all the names. And generally that's understood to be lafdul jalala, the divine name Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then there's an idea of it being encompassing of all the names. So he's in the company of Mawla Abdus Salam Mashish, and at this point he's thinking to himself, with the Shaykh, teach me this divine name. And then it's not the Shaykh who responds because he's just playing with his son, but this young son turns to Abu Hassan Shadi, says, you're the one who wants to know the divine name. He says, don't busy yourself with wanting to know the divine name. You become the divine name. This is another hikmah motive because the idea is that the goal of the divine names is that you have ta'alluq, you are attached to them, then you have tahaqquq, some level of realization, and then you have takhalluq, you become these names. And so when he hears this, then Mullah Abdul Salam said, he says, see, I'm answering you through my son. So this is all kind of references to who Mullah Abdul Salam is. And then so he's undergoing a series of this spiritual companionship with Mullah Abdul Salam at this place on the mountain. And at a certain point, he sees a dream. And in this dream, he sees Mullah Abdul Salam next to the divine throne. And Allah knows best how that's conceptualized. But in his dream, this is what he sees. And so he comes to narrate it to his teacher. And what's very interesting, his teacher says, it wasn't me you saw, it was yourself. Because dreams can be of different types. There can be metaphorical dreams and there can be dreams that are portents of what's about to happen. And metaphorical dreams are symbolic. And in the symbolism of him seeing Mullah Abdus Salam, he said, is the symbolism that you will become me. You will inherit my rank. And he said, this is the goal of Suhbah. إنما صحبتك. I only kept your companion. لأكون أنا أنت وأنت أنا. So that I can become you and you become me. And at that point, Mullah Abdus Salam, for shortly after that, tells Abu Hassan Shadili everything that's in this succinct form of what's going to happen in his life. He says, you're going to leave from here, you're going to go to Ifriqiya, which is now known as Tunis, and you will go to a place called Shadila, and you will practice certain things there, and then you will have the tawfiq after your ascetic practices to gain disciples and to have a tariqah. Then at a certain point you will leave, and then you will go to Egypt, and in Egypt that was where your spiritual reality will find fruition, and that's when you reach the maqam. And everything plays out like that. So at a certain point he leaves his sheikh and he goes to Ifriqiya, Tunis. And this is also a reference in this that the mashayikh, they're not there just to how long can you keep the company of me? The idea is that when you're spiritually ripe, you go and spread this light. But it's very interesting. One of his departing words, and it's actually on the Wikipedia. It says, "Oh Ali, Allah, Allah, God is God, and men are men. When you're amongst the people, keep your tongue from mentioning the sir, and the secret of the reality of what you obtain, the spiritual reality, and your heart from imitating the ways of people who are heedless. Be assiduous in the fulfillment of the mandatory practice of this religion and protect your bodily members from forbidden things, because this idea of spirituality being somehow separate from the Sharia is completely false. And somebody asked me in the Q&A, like, how do we tell a sheikh from a non-sheikh? And well, one of the ways is the mizan of the Sharia, the standards of the Sharia have to apply to everyone. And so that's how you distinguish the plethora of people who be false claimants to Sufism in that they don't follow the Sharia. Um, but another thing is that it has to be premised on people not seeking it for themselves, seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah, wanting Allah. And that's one of the things Shaykh Abu Hassan Shadli said. He used to often say, he used to say that if you can guarantee me two things, then you get wilaya. And one of them is that you're not fearful of people, khawf and nas, what people think of you. And then the other is you don't have you don't have this avidness or anxiety about your providence, your risk. And this includes both the physical and the spiritual. In other words, you have complete slavehood for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're not in it to be special in people's eyes. You're not in it for worldly power. You're not in it. You want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you want Allah, then you're wanted by Allah. Yuhibbuhum wa yuhibbuna. He loves you first. That's why you love him. You won't realize the reality of love in your heart except that Allah loves you first. And that's one of the secrets of the word wali, because it means Wallahum Allah, that they have Allah who's protecting them. And so then he leaves and he goes down to a place called Tunis, which is kind of one of the central towns of Ifriqiya. And then he practices, even though he's left, he still enters into a period of really like a lot of asceticism. And so he goes to this region there in a cave called Jabal Zarwan, close to this city called Shadila. Um, and he has a companion with him. And it seems like, he's doing this and then Allah's still teaching him. So he's with the companion in the cave and, and they're doing meditation or khalwa and dhikr. And Allah sends somebody just passing the cave and he says, you know, what is it? What do you think of someone who thinks, maybe we'll become walis, maybe with this, they won't have any wilayah, they won't have. So it's like Allah's teaching him that it's not about seeking anything other than Allah, Allah, Allah. And then another interesting story that in this is that he often sleeps in the wilderness. So he sleeps in this place where a lot of wild animals come and there's lions, and he doesn't feel a bit of fear. Doesn't feel a bit of fear because he's remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he wakes up in the morning, and as he descends from this kind of hilly area and he goes, then there's these pet partridges, which are these kind of large pigeons. There's a flock of them, and they just flutter up because they're startled by him. So they flutter up, and he gets an absolute fright. He gets an absolute fright. And then he just thinks to himself, he says, Subhanallah. He says, last night I was sleeping and there were lions coming, and I didn't feel a single bit of fear. And now I'm getting fear from these pigeons, partridges. And then as if this voice comes through his heart and it says, Ya Ali, which is his name, Ali, says, last night you were with me. And this night, and you've just woken up with yourself. And this is actually part of the reason why, as he's next to this area called Shadila, he starts entering into this because this is one of the states that the awliya speak about. They say when you enter into this state of strength, of proximity with Allah, then there's a state called even mukalama, as if you're speaking to your heart and as if you're hearing Allah speak to you. So he says, Oh Allah, he says, why am I called Shadili? Because he starts being called Ash-Shadili. He says, I'm not from Shadila, and even though he's in Shadila at the time, I'm not from Shadila because he was from Maghreb. He's from that area next to Tetuan. Then the voice comes back and says, Ya Ali, you're not Shadili because you're from Shadila. Rather, you are Shadun Li. And Shadun Li means you have someone who's been singled out for me. And that's why you'll find some people, when they mention his name, they will say Abu Hassan Ash-Shadhuli instead of Abu Hassan Ash-Shadhili, right? Because they're going back to this incident. In any case, we have to kind of rush his story a bit, even though it's so beautiful to mention him and mention the beautiful incidents that happened in his life, except to mention that often and this is part of the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you find even with the Anbiya, that there are people who are stirred up to enmity from this world. And often they are people of the outward. And Ibn Ajiba, one of the scholars from his lineage, says a lot of the people who are most given to opposing the awliya, or the people of tasawwuf, are the ulama al-zahir, scholars of the outward, because they think in the prestige and in the outward knowledge that they've acquired, that is the summation of all things. And because they are, to the degree that they think that they have attained unto something, and they're not willing to empty themselves like Shaykh Abu Hassan was, then they become people of opposition often to the Sufis. And that's why Ibn Ajib actually mentions that even from the time of Junaid, there was something called the Mehna as-Sufiya, the Inquisition of the Sufis. And you'll often find at different points, different people try, especially ulama who are very close to positions of power, try the Sufis. So there was someone who was very close to the Hafsid sultans, which was one of the offshoots after they broke up from the Muwahhidun um, of that region. And they basically stir up the sultan, and then for a period of time, Sheikh Abu Hassan's imprisoned, and finally, the sultans recognize what Sheikh Abu Hassan is, and Sheikh Abu Hassan says, if I wanted to, I could leave, but I'm adhering to Sharia, which is the way of means. And so he leaves, and they say that he used to often leave and come back. He goes for Hajj and he comes back, and then a period he comes back, he said, I only came back for one person, and that's his main student who we'll be covering in the next lesson, called Abu Basil Mursi. But at a certain point, then he departs for Alexandria, which is still under the Ayyubid Empire, and he's been given patronage by the state there at the time in one of these amazing towers that are adjoining the Corniche area, the area of the sea and he himself lives on a floor, and he's known for a very interesting kind of thing, because this is a time when the Ayyubids were giving a lot of state patronage to Sufis. This is following from Salahuddin's time, because obviously he was very influenced by the tariqas, and especially Shaykh Abdul Qadir Jilani. So with anything, as we said, and I was asked this question, somebody said, should we look for, do real shuyukh exist, and should we join a tariqa? And I'd said real sheikh have to exist, because I believe that this is their light is one of the reasons of this world. There have to be real sheikh there. But instead of saying, do they exist, we have to say, are we sincere enough for Allah to bless us with their company? But looking for tariqah, that's something different. As I said in the previous, I think, couple of lessons, that the institutionalization of a tariqah is an institution. Institutions can have corrupt elements. There are certain errors where institutions can take on negative dimensions. So when I make the distinction, and this goes back to Sidi Ahmad Zarruq's definition of tasawwuf, he doesn't call it tariqas. Sidi Ahmad Zarruq, which is considered one of the foundational definitions. So he said it's just sidqut tawajjuh, sincerity of orientation. But part of that sincerity is recognizing that at this level, a person needs a mentor. That's one of the main reasons. So the idea of having a teacher doesn't necessarily imply exclusivity but tariqah. Let's go back to the story of Shaykh Abu Hassan Shadli. He goes looking for a teacher. He doesn't go looking for a tariqah. He doesn't go to Mashriq saying, let me find a tariqah. He goes to Mashriq saying, let me find a teacher. But in his time, because of the institutionalizations of tariqas, there becomes almost this kind of, and when I say state patronage, so they receive money, you have even more false claimants, and they started wearing kind of this, they call it muraqqa'at, this patched cloth, to try and say who can be more ascetic in their appearance. So they're displaying what's called synthetic asceticism, outwardly appearing as ascetic, but really their hearts are attached to power and money. And so Sheikh Abu Hassan's way was actually very different. He used to dress in very good clothes, and everyone used to be like, the ascetic kind of thing was, I'm going to wear coarse clothes. I'm going to deny myself pleasures. So one of the pleasures of their time was cold water. And, you'd have these people saying, I only drink hot water. And Abu Hassan said, Barid al-ma, make the water cold. Because if you drink the water cold, when you say Alhamdulillah and make shukr, you'll be making shukr through every limb. And so that's one of the reasons why his path has often been known as tariqat al-shukr, the way of gratitude. And he said real zuhud, real asceticism, isn't that you're outwardly displaying poverty, but real zuhud is that you are abstinent of everything else apart from Allah. And that is your poverty, with everything else apart from Allah. إِن يَكُونُوا فُقَرَاءَ, if you can truly be spiritually poor or needy. يُغْنِمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ, Allah will free you from everything besides. And he has a lot of success in Alexandria, and it's in Egypt that some of the greatest people we find of this religion become his students. Izzuddin Abdus Salam, great scholar, a great Shafi scholar called Al-Mundari becomes a student. And it said towards the end of his life, just a couple of years before he dies, he loses his vision, but he still goes out to take part in the Battle of Mansoura against in the Crusades to fight them, even though he's blind. And just as he's about to, just towards the end, he used to always go for Hajj, practically regularly. And so it's almost as if he recognizes this was going to be his last trip, and they go, and he kind of predicts that he will not make it. And in a place called Humaythara, he passes away. And one of the ways he passes away was there was actually a well that was very salty water, and he asked for that well to be brought, and he puts a bit of his spittle back in the water, and they put it back in the well, and the well becomes sweet water. And to this day, if you go to Humaythara next to his where he's buried, and there's now his mosque built there, small place for his tomb, that water is drunk because it's still abundantly sweet. And it's said that his disciple Abu Abbas al-Mursi was designated as his successor. And they say that in the night they knew that he passed away because he was one of the last things he was doing was saying, Allah. You remember the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the night until they stopped hearing him. So this was Sheikh Abu Hassan al-Shadili, and in the next class, inshallah, we'll cover the life of Abu Abbas al-Mursi. Abu Hassan al-Shadili was Abu Hassan al-Shadili. He said, my secret, my books are in my companions and in his awrad, his ahzab. And anyone who's read his ahzab, such as Hizb al-Bahr, the Hizb of the ocean, Hizb al-Nasr, or Hizb al-Kabir, Hizb al-Barr, will see the power of these ahzab. And maybe these are also something we can put on the group. I'm conscious of the time. We've only got 5 minutes of formal time left. I'm happy to go over a bit so we can make about 10 minutes for interaction and question answers. So with that, سبحانك وبحمدك سبحان العظيم والعصر إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Anyone questions, comments? Sister Majda.
Assalamu alaikum. Sorry, can you just repeat? It was he has Hizb al-Bahr and Hizb al-Barr, which is considered the Hizb al-Kabir, right?
Yes,
The third
yes.
one, sorry?
Sorry?
What's the third one, please?
So he has various, his main ones are Hizb al-Nasr, Hizb al-Barr, which is also known as Hizb al-Kabir. Then there's Hizb al-Bahr, and there's also Hizb al-Nur. These are the four main ones I know of him. And then there's also his special supplications that he used to have. What you'll find, some of them are very popular, so they're recited across even in different spiritual paths. So if you go to the Ba'alawi, they very regularly recite Hizb al-Bahr after Asr. And this is something known in different other spiritual paths as well. And it's a very powerful kind of litany. But almost all of them have a kind of like they're very instructive in themselves if you just read them. So there's a lot of tarbiyah in them. Yeah, Majda, you want to say something?
And what does it mean for a sheikh to write a hizb? This is an inspiration that they get. This is from the
La.
men. It's from, is it?
So it's not so much what does it mean for a sheikh. Different people have different, but in the case of a sheikh, the likes of Abu Hassan, these were inspirations, and they were actually often through direct visions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this raises up an interesting question as to what is the demarcation between ilham and wahi. And the demarcation is obviously ilham, or the inspiration of a wali, doesn't have isma, doesn't have infallibility, unlike that of the prophets, and doesn't have ahkam, doesn't have a legislative capacity, but it doesn't change the fact that there is a sense of communion that is actually from that same spiritual inheritance. And this is why you'll find many of them speaking about this. I mean, Ibn Arabi and all of them, that they would have direct visions. And what they would say is that we would write it down straight away, because if you don't capture it initially, then the chances you'd forget it, or that could become weakened. But in the case of Abu Hassan, this is, he said the Prophet, he would see the provisions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but then he would also say that this is a type of communion with him. So, this is people who recite his Ahzab, they are connected to him through that too. So he says, Man qara'a, someone who reads the Hizb, then they have what we have, and we have what they have. So there's this connection to him. And this is often in the connection of tariqas in general, that if the direct link in your chain gives you a litany, then there is a form of transmission and spiritual connection happening between you and that person, and the chain that they're inheritors from in that litany. Does that help, Majda?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. Amanj.
Yes, Ustaz. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam, rahmatullah.
Thank you so much for the session. Actually, what you said last reminded me of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that I wanted to share with you. That he says, "الدنيا ملعونة وملعون ما فيها." I think, correct me if I'm not phrasing it in the literal sense. إلا ذكر الله, he says. And so the point is, how do we grasp what dhikr is? I mean, for some people, it might sound as if it's just a repetition of the adhkar, of the awrad, which is on certain level, it is, on the outermost level, it is the repetition with tongue. But what you said was really interesting, and it is something beyond the material realm, in a sense, which is missing today. And when you say, I think someone asked about the light, the metaphor of light in the group, that I wanted to refer to that question, and I would like you to elaborate more on that. And it was, in a sense, it seemed to me that the concept of light, when it's used, it's taken very materially, in a material way. So someone would ask, what's the shape of the light? What's the color of the light? But it's not on the material level. We have to go beyond the body to really grasp the metaphysical ideas, the ideas that are in the Sufi literature and are in the tariqas, for example. When you heard the term dhikr, for example, it all depends on your level of being, on your status, in a sense, what you can grasp of that concept. For someone like, for example, for someone like Ibn Arabi, how would he understand what dhikr is? And how would I understand what dhikr is? When he said Allah, for example, what would be his soul state when saying that? And when I say that, what's my in a sense resonance within? So my point here is knowledge, or what we get and what we get through words, in a sense, it all depends on our status. And the key is, for example, when there is something that we don't understand, it means we are on a certain level, maybe, that we are not still receiving that kind of knowledge the way we should receive. So we have to do some work on ourselves. And I think that's one problem in many of the what's found in the Sufi literature. When people come in touch with them, they they try to understand it from their own level without moving a bit forward or without moving a bit above their own levels. So that's what I wanted to share with you, Ustad, and I would appreciate if you can elaborate.
I think
Or
my
maybe
face is
correct me.
I think my face is frozen on this camera. I think my
You
connection doesn't seem to be the strongest at the moment.
are you
Uh,
frozen at your state?
Allah yatub alayna. So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yani one of the things that he says is, "Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'inna al-qulub." Is it not through the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that hearts uh, not sure if everyone can hear me. Yeah, okay. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'inul qulub." Is it not through the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that hearts find itminan? I think I've got this. I think I went in and out again. Okay, good. You can hear me. Okay, good. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Is it not through dhikr of Allah that hearts find itminan?" And so here the reference is a itminan in qulub. And what are qulub? These are effectively portals of presence, and they're portals of presence to dhikr, i.e., remembering who we really are. And that's why we find this state of contentment, because the word dhikr has often been translated as remembrance. And why is it remembrance? Because the more you engage in it, and you engage in it in the correct intentions, then you're reminding yourself of who you really are. And part of that goes back to the primordial experience that we had when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala manifested himself to us in what is known as the covenant of Alast. And he said, Alastu bi rabbikum? قالوا بلى شهدنا. The soul said, yes, indeed, we have witnessed it. So this was a covenant of us witnessing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, witnessing him from a position of, as Imam Junaid said, this true witnessing is not the witnessing of a subject-object division, but is a witnessing of ourselves as being part of the manifestation of his rububiyyah, his lordship upon us, through tahqiq al-ubudiyyah, the realization of our slavehood. And so that's why dhikr here is the paradigm by which we transform ourselves. And that's why part of this tariqas is that يعني لا تترك الذكر لعدم حضورك مع الله فيه. Do not leave your invocation or dhikr of Allah because of your lack of presence with Allah therein. Because it might just be that with your ghafla of dhikr, that's just a ghafla on the tongue. Yani, as long as you have a presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if it's on the tongue, it's better than your ghafla an dhikr, that you leave aside dhikr before. And if you persist in this dhikr with the tongue, then it might just be that this dhikr will go from just this dhikr with forgetfulness to a dhikr with yaqadata, to a dhikr of attentiveness. And then it might just be, if you persist, then it will go to a dhikr from attentiveness to a dhikr of hudur. And it might just be, if you persist, then you go from a dhikr of hudur to dhikr with nothing else besides siwa mathkur. You'll be absent from everything except with the one who's been made dhikr of. وَمَا ذَلِكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ بِعَزِيزٍ. That's not something difficult for Allah. So the idea of dhikr here is that there are successive stages by which we come to know who we are, and we enter in. But the idea is not that we're all going to be there at the same level to start off with, or that we need to expect some great transcendental experience. And if it's not happening, then it's not working. No, it's working at whatever level we are. But sometimes medicine is meant to taste bitter because we're sick. So the dhikr produces a sense of discomfort, but in that discomfort is actually a healing. And this is actually something that's known in certain traditional forms of medicine. They call it the healing crisis, right? The manifestation of discomfort is actually an expunging of toxicity. So dhikr is the paradigm by which things change. But this is actually goes back to why I was speaking about the need for a mentor, because it's not always one size fits all. And there are certain dhikr that can be off the counter. Anyone can do them. And these are the dhikr that are often masnoon, that have been authenticated from the Prophet ﷺ, that he used to do regularly. Dhikr such as salawat, which even there's hadith that said if you were to do continually, then it would only cause you goodness, which is the salawat on the Prophet ﷺ. But then there are other dhikr which can have a power, but they are jalali and they need prescription. They need a sense of idhn. They need a sense of permission. And this is why there is a lineage. This is why there is mentorship, because the idea is there is a skill set involved of people who have traversed these spiritual points, so they know pitfalls and potential issues that can happen. And anyone who takes this lightly just needs to look at the phenomenon called majdub. Majdoubs are what in English often translated as spiritual madmen. But their story is often that they did these things without a permission, that they didn't have a teacher. And so they were pulled out of their minds. They literally became disheveled from their intellectual apparatus through dhikr. So this is why dhikr is very important, but at the same time, dhikr has to be given within the paradigm of this instruction if we want to have this graded progression to these higher levels of the spiritual path. Does that help, Amanj?
Yes, Ustad. Thank you.
Yeah. And obviously the experience, and this is,
Mm.
we would say the experience of Sheikh Abu Hassan or Ibn Arabi and these people making dhikr is not the experience of someone else making dhikr.
Yeah.
You know.
And part of what you said was the most interesting point to me, and that you said it is in a successive stage or in certain different levels. I think
Yeah.
the idea of levels is the key here, that we are not on the same level.
Yeah.
And and that's ironically, I mean, it's very difficult to grasp in this era, especially where equality is applied on everything, and it's something that you hear a lot, that you can get knowledge as much as you can now, but it's not true. Knowledge, it really depends on your state of your soul,
Yeah.
and we know that soul is not in the formula, let's say, in the paradigms nowadays.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Ustad.
Very, very nice. Thank you. Maybe time for one last comment question. Saira? Saira, you've got your hand raised, I think. Saira Qureshi. So I think someone has to unmute her. Yeah.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Jha.
Alaikum salam wa
Jazakallah
rahmatullah.
khair. I've been meaning to join and I just find so on many levels very relatable to go through this Dora. Two requests. One is please kindly also cover female saints maybe along the way, inshallah. You have more knowledge, so we would like to benefit from that, inshallah. Especially Dr. Jha, one name that comes to mind is Rabia Basri, inshallah. And then the other thing is more on the note of this intellectual aspect of asceticism that you just mentioned, the wahi and ilham. So I'm wondering if after a life turning event, you get drawn to dhikr and you get drawn to, let's say, writing. And I'm saying it with complete humility. And you think that compared to or in contrast with previously writing poetry or just prose even, if all you want to write about is spirituality and ilahi related um, thoughts, ideas, praise, um, Sufistic sense of, you almost feel like your pen and your heart and your conscious is drawn to it. And you're amazed that in a humble way, in a sad, humble way, like almost like with a sense of being committed to something like that, where it was not in your imagination, would you think that given the asceticism, why? I mean, I watched Yunus Emery's life history also, that he was a Qazi and then he became a poet, as he walked the path of spirituality, and um, how his life changed and how he became more humble. I'm wondering if that kind of a personal transformation is something that we obviously learn this from the scholars and sheikh or um, Sufis who go down this path. But I think there is something to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala putting trials in our life, obviously, so that we can be inspired to have a very singular mind to then devote ourselves to this sort of spiritual connection that we were utterly missing in our life. Jazakallah khair. Thank you.
وإياكم إن شاء الله. On the topic of spiritual biographies and female teachers, so we're only in this series, we're just limiting ourselves to the purposes of the biographies for the people to introduce us to the book, so that when we're going to read the Hikam, which is Ibn Ata'ilah's work, we're just going to cover his immediate lineage. So that's why we're doing Abu Hassan Shadli, Abu Basim Rusi, who is his teacher, and then Ibn Ata'ilah, the author of the Hikam. As a whole, though, you know, I was reminded of this interesting comment that I don't know if many of you know Peter Sanders, but he's often taking pictures, and he recently coupled with someone called Harun Sugic to have a picture come biographical project of modern day saints and teachers, and I think it was called Meeting with Mountains. And he had this thing of, you know, we want to have an almost equal distribution of men and women. And he remembers interviewing a teacher who said, there always is. He said, there's always an equal distribution of this spiritual light between men and women, because they are in many ways, you know, parallel and yet complementary of this tajalli. But he said the default is that the nature of women entails more satar. Yani they have to, their spiritual thing is often more hiding of themselves, because that's just how that feminine spiritualities manifest, right from people like probably one of the greatest or the greatest of women, which is Fatima radiallahu anha. She wanted to be hidden. And that's part and parcel, perhaps, why we don't have that many, but there are prominent names, like you said. So I don't want anyone thinking that this is a masculine thing. This isn't, this is a Nurani thing that finds its expression in men and women. About the second thing, I mean, this we focused a bit on the idea of inspiration, but I particularly like the last thing you said, which is singularizing yourself for Allah. For some people, this may be the outpouring that it comes through the form of poetry, through the form of thing. And for other people, it just might be they just get along with their lives. Because we don't want to idealize and sacralize a form of this is what great spirituality is. The reality is that heart for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And most of the awliya are hidden. And they say this is the hikmah, one of the hikmah for it is because if they were to be manifest and people showed bad adab to them, then this brings about a man adali waliyan faqad adhantuhu bil harb. Someone who's opposed to my wali, Allah says in Hadith Qudsi, I declare war upon them. And so it's almost in their mercy for the ummah that they don't want to attract a lot of opposition, because people generally don't have adab with people, and we've got our own conceptions of, you know, who we think deserving of adab, and generally the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are hidden, so as a way of mercy for people. So you know, and this is why they say you don't think that the wali has to be a certain form. He might be the person you encounter washing your car, or you know, cleaning the streets, or, and that's more than likely because that's how they prefer to be, not to be have great hagiographical literature written about them, except for the few, such as Abu Hassan Shadli and Abu Qadir Jilani and so on, who've been given a function. So alongside their wilaya, they have this function of being guides and teachers in part of this continuity of the function of this lineage. So that's not, we don't want to typify things, and we also don't want to assume that as part of my expression, if I'm drawing near to Allah, that it has to translate into my latest works of poetry. Because I think a lot of us will struggle on that front, maybe. So inshallah khair, inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala connect us to the awliya. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the love of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam and connect us to those he loves and those who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger. May he give us this mahabbat al-khalisa wa ma'rifat al-khasa, and may he free us from love of this world and everything else besides. وما ذلك على الله بعزيز والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. ربنا تقبل منا بسر أسرار الفاتحة. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. سبحانك وبحمدك سبحان العظيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Those of you who've written comments and questions in the chat, don't worry, we'll get round to it. And if you want to leave some more questions based on what I've said in the WhatsApp group, they will soon be collated, and inshallah I'll try and get round to answering them. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
جزاك الله خير.
وإياكم. السلام عليكم.